This opening session, um, we are basically going to have a very free-floating discussion about the state of the world, because it's an opening session and we get to do ambitious things like that. And it will, in a sense, set the tone for the next 3 days. And many of the sessions that we have over the course of rest of today and the next 2 days will revisit many of the themes or topics that get touched here, but they will then focus more in depth on some of those issues. I want to take a minute to explain the premise or the title of this panel and then turn to my guests with questions. We've called this panel, "The World is Round." To many, it will be obvious that it's a reference to a famous, popular journalistic title of about a decade ago or a decade and a half ago. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, there seemed to be a brief season of euphoria to the extent that some people felt free to pronounce the end of history. And by 2000, with the first great tech bubble emerging, others went so far as to say the world is flat. To the extent that we thought that everybody is now rushing, every country is rushing to become a free market democracy. That was not a terribly far off expectation. And to a great extent, of course, most countries do want to have democracies. With all due caveats, most countries also now accept free market as an efficient enough system. But flatness also implies cultural flatness. Whether that is desirable, in that moment of utopia, that sort of question or anxiety was relegated to the side. But from 9/11 to the Paris attacks last week, what has been exposed in the last 15 years is the great structural unevenness that has been hiding beneath this optimistic expectation of a flat, convergent world. And we seem to be, after a brief period of relative peace or seeming prosperity, in a world that is, on the one hand, suffering more inequality than we thought would be the case 10 years ago, suffering more conflicts, full of tumult. So we will ask our guests about why that is. Why is the world the way it looks now? And before I turn to geopolitical questions and also questions of their implications for our region, I want my first question to be for Jude Kelly, who famously, before the last elections, suggested that England, or UK, which I think recently ranked rather poorly in sort of global measurements of status of women and their rights and their participation in politics, economics, and so on, that equality would not arrive unless there was a feminist party. So I want to ask Jude, in a world, to me, it seems that in a world where women, a world that is safe for women and fair for women would actually end up being a world that is safe and fair for everyone else as well. But despite many progresses, especially of the last 100 years, recent decades, which in many ways have been remarkable decades for women's progress, the degree of inequality we still see, and especially, and certainly in our region, sometimes the kind of patterns of violence against women we see is frankly still absolutely appalling and astounding.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this festival. This is my first time in Dhaka, first time in Bangladesh, although not the first time in the region, and I'm very honored to come. And the question you're asking me is a geopolitical question. Women are indivisibly part of all politics and all geography, and women's roles and women's rights are not a side issue or a minority issue or something to be considered alongside a few other issues. We're talking about half of the human race being perceived as unequal in the most fundamental ways with regard to all theologies and all economic systems. And in a festival such as this, if that is not considered to be a central issue, then I think that's because we have something in our eyes that make us blind. when people said to me, why are you going to Bangladesh? Aren't there security problems? I pointed out that 2 women are killed every day in the UK by their partner. I pointed out that every 8 minutes in South Africa, a woman is raped. There are far more deaths every single day for women, regardless of terrorism, than you will ever get through acts of terrorism. So the issue of security and violence for women is an ongoing daily problem. And to put in front of that the issue of whether a few people may or may not randomly blow up a shopping mall or a cafe is frankly small fry compared to this endemic violence against women, which at the moment people are only half-heartedly thinking about. Now, when Fukuyama said that history is over, we can now, because of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the flood of capital growth, move forward into a free operating system of market and so on. There was no mention made of actual rights, people's rights. But what we do know is that in countries that attend to women's education, in countries that attend to women's equality, although I point out that no country has equality, but in countries that have made this an act of determination to fully educate girls and women and to fully allow them to be part of the workforce, it is very clear, all the evidence is there, that the societies are much more likely to be peaceful. They are much more likely to be held away from the terrible energy that goes with fundamentalism. And I would finally just say, because this is a panel that we all want to talk about, that just as I was leaving to get my yellow fever injection to fly off to Dakar, in our country we were debating whether or not to join military attacks on Syria. And one of our politicians was saying we mustn't do that because every evidence we've had before of interfering in other people's states brings about greater problems. And he used this phrase. He said, let's take Iraq. This was Ken Livingstone. Let's take Iraq. He said, we bomb their country, we rape their women, and et cetera, et cetera. And I was so struck by the phrase, their women, because it seemed to me that in the very center of language, and since this is a literature festival, this is why I tend to it, the very center of language, this idea that women are property in a free market or not a free market. Nevertheless, women are still talked about as property. Their women, our women. So I would say, finally, that the issue of security is so related to whether or not you believe in freedom for women.
Thank you. I'd like to take that cue and go to Ram. A similar phrase of optimism from our region and from India in particular would be the whole notion of India shining. Yeah. And in many respects, of course, it has shown in ways it didn't in the past. There has been a lot of progress, but there's also issues of the kind that Jude just mentioned. It's showing up in different ways in every region. In India, it's not just the violence against women, but also violence against minorities, religious, lower caste, and so on. Now, in your writing and thinking, you have, until very recently, always had a lot of confidence in the institutions of democracy and liberalism, and you believed that India will not turn truly intolerant, it will be safeguarded. And that was, I think, your thought even before the last elections. But 18 months, to paraphrase your famous title, India after Modi, how optimistic do you feel?
I'll come to India after Modi in a minute, but let me just add to what Jude said about the vital importance of gender equality. If you can look at gender equality in 3 ways. Equality before God, equality under the law, and equality in social practice. Now, in my understanding, all major religions of the world deny women equality before God. They're varied. You can argue whether Christianity is slightly better than Islam, which is slightly better or worse than Hinduism, but that's a semantic argument. Before God, every major religion of the world is patriarchal and gives man a superior place to women. If you look at equality before the law, most modern democracies grant equality under the law. It's true of Great Britain, it's true of my country, maybe true of Bangladesh. Of course, it's not true of all countries. It's not true of Saudi Arabia and some countries, the Gulf. But finally, equality in social practice, which is, even when there is equality before the law, it is denied in social practice. And India is a very good example, because if you look at India, or not a very good example, a bad example, I should say. Not a good example, a bad example. If you look at debates on inequality in India, they've historically been dominated by debates about caste inequality. The one fundamental axis of inequality in India is caste, where people are graded according to the family or community they're born into. And of course, in South Asia, possibly in Bangladesh too, but certainly in India, Muslims and Christians also practice caste. So caste inequality, which is pervasive, endemic, deep-rooted, obnoxious, inhuman, has been focused upon. Gender inequality is slightly less. And if I was to think of India the last 50 or 60 years, we have made some progress in tackling caste inequality. I believe that untouchables or Dalits, who are at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, although Dalits in India are still extremely oppressed and exploited, they're less oppressed and exploited than at any previous stage in known history. We are talking about 60 years of slow incremental progress of promoting caste equality in practice against 5,000 years of scripturally sanctioned caste inequality. So there is some progress. With women, in the last 8 or 10 years, there's been a savage patriarchal backlash. Attacks on women in Indian cities are much more open, much more brutal. There was always violence in the home, which was contained, and there was incest, and there was discrimination, and women were not allowed to go to college, and so on and so forth. But now the sheer brazenness and brutality of physical attacks on women in India is striking in many, many cities in terms of, some of the cases that have been discussed, the Nirbhaya case in Delhi, for example, and the case of 2 Dalit women being raped and hanged in UP, and several other cases. And I think this is something, there are 2 aspects to this. The first is patriarchy is striking back. 40 or 50 years ago, you had a similar wave of upper caste attacks on Dalits, because, privileged people don't like being challenged. When they are, their first reaction is to challenge back. When social opinion gathers in favor of equality, then slowly they retreat. So today in India, every politician accepts, in theory, that untouchability is bad. But we haven't yet made that decisive leap when it comes to gender. Gender inequality is seriously and radically enforced by scriptural practice and in social practice, by scriptural sanction and in social practice. Now, this is in some ways connected to India shining, or the darker side of India shining. The Indian model of economic growth has not been labor intensive. Unlike China, it's been based on services, not on manufacturing. So though you have generated wealth, you've generated lots of foreign exchange, you have not really employed too many men. And India now has an overabundance of young, frustrated, unemployed or underemployed men. And these are the people who become Hindu fundamentalists, who become Islamic jihadists, who join the Naxalite or Maoist movement, and who attack women. So the lopsided nature of our economic growth is in part contributing to the extremely disturbing attacks on women that you find. Bangalore, my hometown. My wife, when I was courting her 30 years ago, it was safer for her to go around the streets than it is for my daughter today. So in the South, typically in the South, there were more women in public life, there was less violence against women, but that is all rapidly changing. And I think this is an aspect of Indian social life today that is underappreciated, because we are still caught in, we still seem to think that caste inequality is the most important and most fundamental aspect of social life in India. It is still important, but I think gender inequality is pervasive. The number of women in parliament is declining. The number of women entrepreneurs, it's very hard to be a woman entrepreneur. Again, you look at Bangalore, it's a startup city. It's much easier to be a man who can go get his brochure printed. I mean, for a woman to go to a printing house to get a brochure printed is to expose herself, on an hourly basis. So these are, I think, questions, to just emphasize, and here I'll conclude, there was always a kind of suppressed violence against women in the home. There were always certain boundaries women were not supposed to cross. But the kind of naked and brutal violence that you now see at an everyday level against women in Indian towns and cities and villages, I think this deserves much more attention from journalists, from social reformers, and from politicians than it has so far. And it has some connection to the darker side of India, Shai.
Thank you, Ram.
Based on what we've heard so far, the two things I take away from that before I turn to John. One is, men have done, I'm not allowed to say authored the scripts, but let's say interpreted them primarily. They've done the job of interpreting, they've certainly made the laws, and they're also still, for the most part, administering the laws. And it's often driven by ideas of how they wish to control women. And it becomes almost a dual-edged thing, where so much is done with the objective of controlling women, but it's sublimated into other greater abstractions and ideologies and reasonings and moralities and so on. But as that superstructure takes place, it makes the oppression more self-fulfilling, it compounds the effect. Another thing is, you're talking about how Bangalore was safe and not quite so 30 years later. We've also, I think, gone through the 30 years that has brought more multitudes into democracies and into cities than before, but without fair or sufficient opportunities. And I think in a sense you are commenting on that. So with that thought that, we looked ahead and thought the world would be a better place, a more civilized place. Instead, we are stunned by the level of violence and types or patterns of violence, whether it's on a geopolitical scale with the number of conflicts, Syria, Crimea, so on and so forth, or whether it's in these matters of more intimate spaces, our own cities, the streets, the homes, and so on. My question to you, John, would be to take a step back and start from a big picture point of view. You have famously written Shooting History, in which you actually give a rather personal account of your journalistic work, which is something a lot of journalists don't always do. There's this pretense of objectivity. And since then, in your work, you've sort of really put yourself out there. My question is, in 1989, if I'm not mistaken, when you started Channel 4, as presenter for Channel 4, and that was the year the Berlin Wall fell, how you thought the world would be? What shocks you the most 25 years later? What is different from what you thought it would be?
I think the first thing is that I'm of the generation which never thought the wall would come down. I mean, it was a permanent fact that it would be there forever. And so when it came down, it was obviously a tremendous shock. And I don't think I remember saying to my cameraman standing in Berlin, I remember we were in the eastern side of the Brandenburg Gate one day after the wall came down, and I said, do you realize, old chap, these two countries could be one, maybe in, 10 years? Within 10 weeks, they were more or less one country. At tremendous cost, but they were. So I wouldn't be a good person to forecast at that moment how the world was going to be. But there are very interesting ways of looking at this. I mean, I think first of all, we perhaps don't look at the extent to which the communist bloc and the capitalist bloc led by America dominated the world order. If you look, for example, in Latin America, before the Iraq War, this is not an immediate consequence of the coming down of the Berlin Wall, but before the Iraq War, America was obsessed with its backyard, was obsessed with Latin America, and coups were plentiful, and all of them involved Americans. They were always involved. The CIA had active stations in virtually every Latin American country. Since the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, there has not been one military coup in Latin America. There has not been any overthrow of democracy, And although there are obviously weak links and the rest of it, the fact is that it has been largely left alone. That is not to say that in Brazil there is not an economic crisis, and that in many of the countries there are all sorts of social tensions and difficulties. But fundamentally, Latin America has proceeded in a coolest, if that is an English word, I'm not sure, in a coolest direction. It's cool as well, and it'll be even more cool when we have the Olympics in Rio. But I just point to that as one area of the world where you could argue life has got better. I think life has also got better in Africa, oddly enough. 5% growth. Of course, there's still acute and dreadful poverty in Africa. But everybody had their client states in Africa. Russia had Somalia, for example. And actually Siad Barre, who was their president before the wall came down, and who was a classic kind of Russian-backed. Well, sometimes American-backed. It was interesting that he would veer between one and the other, whichever one happened to be in port on that day. But at any rate, he was fundamentally a pro-communist president. Well, when he went, fundamentally, order went. And so I would argue that the disorder that we've got has at least some considerable measure. It is to some extent, it has flowed from the collapse of both Russian and American influence, strategic influence in the world. And that, as I've tried to point out, in some ways has been a good thing, a very good thing. And in some ways it has unleashed all sorts of things which we did not expect to occur. Now, of course, one of the issues about the instability of the world is that the Western world, because of its hunger for oil, is incredibly invested in countries in which there are conflicts, particularly religious conflicts, between strands of Islam, strands of other faiths too. And I think particularly of the compromise, in a sense, the West enjoys, or maybe doesn't enjoy quite as much as it used to, in the Arabian Peninsula, where certainly Britain and America and France in particular are hugely dependent on trading arms and weapons in return for oil. Now, of course, America has suddenly become less dependent on oil and is slightly less interested in Saudi Arabia than it was. And the Saudi Arabians are having to make up for that. But out of this region has sprung some of the most difficult and contentious radicalism that we're having to deal with. And I would argue history will wonder how it was, particularly after 9/11, which I think I never knew when I was reporting 9/11, the attack on the Twin Towers in New York. I never knew that I was looking at an event which was potentially more momentous than the wall coming down. I mean, we thought it was a terrible thing, and that I remember thinking in the first few weeks after the attack on New York and on the Pentagon, nothing happened. Just for a few weeks, the world caught its breath and thought, and I thought for one moment that America had matured, and that in some way there would not be a massive response of any notable description. Of course, I was completely wrong. They just needed time. They just needed time to organize themselves and invade a country. It was just a question of which country should be invaded, and it was decided Afghanistan was the one, because that was where bin Laden had obviously had some shelter. But I think history will ask how it is that in a situation in which 17 of the 18 hijackers were Saudis, and in which the ringleader was of a very, very prominent Saudi family, you know, with ramifications which extended into the royal family and whatever, how it was that nobody said, well, hang on a minute, shall we just think about this? Shall we just try to work out what happened here? You see, to this day, I don't think any of us know much about the intricacies of the faith issues, Wahhabism, for example, within Saudi Arabia, and its relationship to the power structures. It's very, very complex, and it's a kind of compromise, not the least of which involves the export of Wahhabi preachers and madrasas, particularly to Pakistan, Afghanistan, a few here, maybe many, I don't know how many, I'm not an expert, I've never been here before, but I know there are some. That is a tenet of the Wahhabi belief system, which is that you proselytize, you go and extend the faith wherever you can. And some have come to Germany and indeed to Britain. So I don't think one can track that all to the Berlin Wall coming down, which is where we began. And I may have gone in various directions. After all, I've been to Rio now, I've been to Somalia, and I've tried to weave in. But I think very complicated things are going on, which nobody seems to want to talk about. They're primarily interested at the moment in economy, in the world economy. That is the big thing. Now, of course, Paris is an absolutely shocking experience. I mean, this is a very small and very interlinked city, which has been blown apart, really, by this lone attack, I say lone, the attacks on three places, mainly by indigenous people who came from France, but with connections and input from abroad. And that's where we are.
I think Ram and Jude, you both wanted to respond.
Well, what struck me about what we were all discussing, really, was this issue of the basic human urge for self-determination, which right back to the keynote speech this morning, and the reason for a festival like this is the human being instinctively knows that they need to have agency, not just in a tiny circumference of their domestic life, but more than that. They know that, and they have an urge for it. But they also know they have to have structures and patterns and narratives that they've agreed with. And when you get this story, as John described, of this crisscrossing of very, very strong forces, political forces, the US, Russia, China now, I think, and scriptural tradition insisting on the way that societies will be organized, then you're always creating chaos, because you're always removing self-determination from people, and they will always retaliate. And I think that the thing that John has talked about as well, which is the relationship of Saudi Arabia to a lot of this, it's fascinating how you end up with a no-go area. I mean, that no-go area of Saudi Arabia is very confusing. It's confusing in the UK because the royal family have a very intimate relationship with other royal families around the world. It's peculiar because we have all of these trading agreements. And yet, as you say, it's like we know what we don't want to know, which is that a lot of the power of deliberate organized chaos is coming from that same place. And so one of the things I'm interested to know is why we are all choosing, the three wise monkeys, to see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil against something there. I mean, I am genuinely bemused. And going back to this point about self-determination, which is where you end up feeling as if you have to find respect, you have to get respect back again. I mean, we've talked, when Paris was bombed, one of the things that people said was, will this make Parisians, and indeed anybody who identifies with Paris, will they understand that on a daily basis, this is what Syrians are experiencing, and this is why Syrian refugees are coming in millions, because on a daily basis, it is like this. And I think, sadly, the answer will be no. That's not what the reaction will be. Because when people feel as if they have their power taken away from them, which is what Paris now feels like, doesn't it? As if they're powerless to sort of organize their own safety. They don't necessarily then turn to empathy. They turn to violence as a way of, and you can see that from the way that Hollande has immediately said, right, well, there's a military action to be done. So this very root of human freedom, which is I suppose where the women issue comes in, is that I still believe that if half the world operating the military coups, the military strikes, the terrorist actions, if those half of the world tend to be men looking for power, it's because they haven't thought about redistributing power with the rest of the human race. And until that happens, I mean, that maybe sounds naive, but I really think that there is a massive deficit of power distribution which forces people over and over again to go down the same paths. And they do say that if you keep hitting your head against a brick wall, you know, it's an example of madness, because you're expecting something different to happen. So I think the world's madness is still because it's not looking in the other direction and saying, well, how could we give away power, not just accumulate it?
Yeah, I was just listening to John and then to Jude. I mean, two major terrorist attacks have been mentioned. 9/11, which happened in 2001, and the Paris attacks, which were recent and which are fresh in everybody's memory. There's something that happened almost exactly in between, and that is the 2008 attacks in Mumbai, which were very similar, with one difference. Manmohan Singh, who was Prime Minister, and who was Prime Minister for 10 years, and whom history will remember as a weak, indecisive, ineffectual Prime Minister who condoned corruption and institutional decay. I don't think history will change that judgment. But his one brave, even heroic act, heroic in a modest way, was not to yield to the crazed demands for retribution and bomb Pakistan. You know, I think this is important for this reason. As John mentioned, 17 out of the 18 attackers in 9/11 were Saudi nationals or whatever, right? In Paris, many of them were homegrown. The 2008 attacks on Mumbai were absolutely in the know of Pakistani intelligence. Whether, you see, the Pakistan is a complicated place where the civilian government is not in control of the military is not in control of the ISI is not in control of the terrorist groups. Right, but we certainly know that at least elements in the ISI knew about the terrorist attacks. They were planned in Pakistan, and yet we did not bomb them. The second interesting thing about what happened in 2008 was that terrorists wanted to do two or three things. One is, of course, scare the world, show a spectacular act like Paris or like the bombing of the World Trade Centers, but they also wanted to set off Hindu-Muslim violence in India. And the Indian Hindus and the Indian Muslims did not fall for it. And there was actually, part of it was, you know, we had at that stage a very upright, the police commissioner of Mumbai was a Muslim at that stage. And he was very able and respected. The Muslims of Mumbai refused to bury the terrorists because of what they said what they'd done was un-Islamic. But I think the important thing was that Manmohan Singh, in I think what history will remember as the finest moment of his prime ministership, did not yield to the hawks and the jingoes. Whether in a similar, God forbid, the thing that frightens me most about India today is if there's another terror attack. Because I don't know whether Narendra Modi will have the same wisdom and sagacity in a similar situation, right? Now, that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say was to quiz John a little bit about this, John, because you followed these things in a much more direct and upfront and at-hand way than certainly the two of us and others in this room. You know, it's been my sense as an lay observer of these events, that there was some justification for the attack on Afghanistan by the Americans, for the following reason. Al-Qaeda, not just bin Laden, but Al-Qaeda was given hospitality and support, financial and others, by the government of Pakistan. You could, at a stretch, interpret it as an attack on America aided by the government of Pakistan. Let me finish what I'm saying. But there was absolutely no justification for the Iraq war, unlike Afghanistan. And Mr. Tom Friedman comes in here because, again, as an observer, looking at all of this from India, my sense was that, in many ways, the most shameful aspect of the crescendo that led to the war in Afghanistan was the support given to George Bush by professedly liberal columnists like Thomas Friedman and by the British Prime Minister.
I don't disagree at all.
So let me finish.
I didn't make myself clear about Afghanistan.
So I wanted to ask you, supposing,
I fully accept.
No, supposing it had stopped with Afghanistan and not gone to Iraq, would we have had much of all this going on?
But we need to strip that one away.
Sure,
what did stopping in Afghanistan mean? I mean, they went after the Al-Qaeda camps, they got them out, they bombed them, they attacked them on the ground, they finished them off, and then they should have left. But instead they decided to build a Western democracy. What right did they have to build a Western democracy? I'm somebody who in the past, when I was a student, I took tea with old redbeards sitting on my haunches in Kandahar, and it was sublime. We didn't speak a common language, but we drank the same tea. You know, that is a thing which will never happen again. We will never be able to sit on our haunches with redbeards in Kandahar. A lot of them are dead, and we won't be able to drink tea. I mean, that's a sort of, it was a complete outrage that what began as a criminal response, a response to a crime against humanity, a war crime, that they dealt with it and then refused to move. They stayed there and tried to design a state, which is now falling apart, if not already fallen apart. And the difference with Iraq was just one big war crime. No question at all. There was no justification for doing it. And I mean, what is so tragic about Iraq, which was a country I knew very well. I was there for the Iran-Iraq war. I was there for things, you know, to do with Saddam and the rest of it. But what existed there was a very tender lattice work of Sunni and Shia relationships. Lots of intermarriages, lots of intercommunal relationships, villages which were mixed, and there was no interreligious tension. There was the old boy up there, and they didn't like him, and some of them did like him, but in the end, they certainly found him a tyrant. But beneath him, there was this very, very delicate society which existed. There were Sunni shrines in Shia areas, Shia shrines in Sunni areas, and it worked. They lived peaceably together. And then what do you do if you drop a bomb on it? What you do is you give birth to ISIS, and that's what we did. Every time there is an ISIS strike, I believe many, many people on earth think we did that. We brought that about. We were the agents of the birth of this vile if you blow families to pieces, if you send 4 million people out of the country in flight, and you destroy the homes of many millions too, and you kill at least 150,000, but probably very many more, nobody knows how many, then what happens? When people come out of that saying, well, I don't believe in any of you, and I'm prepared to do anything.
And can I just say that one of the things that was so appalling to hear over and over again were politicians in the West saying, well, we're doing this for women. You know, we're doing this because women don't have rights. We want the girls to be educated. And yet you knew that they were not applying, you know, look to your own backyard first is one of the things you wanted to say. And secondly, the fact that the result of that interference is that women's situation is far worse. And they were not allowed finally at the peace tables. And, you know, the result has been a chaos, which again is this issue of self-determination. It's not up to all of those military men to tell other countries how to treat their women, which is the language in which they spoke and speak.
Well, you know, we would like to open up for questions because I'm sure people in the audience have a lot of questions for all of you. Before I move to that, I just wanted to respond to what the two of you have said in terms of you've pointed to the fact that, okay, there's, you know, a known problem in Saudi Arabia, we don't want to deal with it. So on the one hand, we have one kind of problem that's coming out of inertia, and then we have a kind of activity when we go into Iraq or something, which is, you know, born of naivete or arrogance or just reactivity. It's like neither is a good way to respond. And the other thing John pointed out is like, look at Latin America. You know, we pull back, and now it's in many senses a more peaceful place. It almost strikes me, and maybe because it's a lit fest, I'm allowed to put it in these terms. This would never stand in a policy think tank. What we've inherited out of inertia and naivete, and the only thing that will save us is fatigue. when the world is too tired to go in again, maybe we will have peace. But with that, I think we would like to start taking questions from the audience. If we can have some lights, please. And you know, there's a lot of people who probably want to put up their hands, so I request all of you, do please, out of consideration for everyone else who'd want a chance, keep your question very brief and do make it a question. No comments, please, just questions. You actually can't see very well. Okay, there's a hand there. Yes, please. Is that for anyone or? Okay.
No, personally, I do not think World War III has started. I think that there is a very serious period of threat and instability and inequality. I mean, the inequality is, I think, possibly worse than it was when the wall came down, within countries and across the world between countries. Poverty, unquestionably there has been an improvement in terms of global poverty, but it's still very, very bad. And there is ostentatious and unacceptable wealth on a terrifying scale when contrasted with poverty. And I think, when we're looking at these guys in France who did this against their own people, killing some of their own believers. I mean, it wasn't just to hit at non-Muslim French people. I think that this is not World War III, but it is about alienation. People who feel they have no stake in society and no prospects, and in a sense have become self-loathing because they see the success of others, and they can see it more visibly than ever in history. The social network, which you can be very poor but somehow have access to a mobile phone, and what you can see of how other people have and you have not is a great ground for alienation and a sense of hopelessness. And that if there is a World War III, it's one we should declare on poverty and inequality.
It's interesting that you asked that question, because I was trying to imagine the other day under what circumstances would I believe that trying to eradicate ISIS could be achieved or should be achieved. And I thought it could only be achieved if there was a world alliance against the principles that ISIS is putting forward. That it would it couldn't be airstrikes by the French and the UK. I just think that's just going to be more chaos. But there does need to be a world agreement. I don't know whether that's the same as a war, but to rid the idea of a growing caliphate with the principles of ruthless inequality that are being proposed, I think that can only be done by a world agreement, which does contain, John, then, why you would fight ISIS. You have to fight ISIS for the things that they say they believe in, which the world does not believe in. And that debate doesn't really seem to have happened amongst the world yet.
The trouble with that is that not everybody agrees. No. For example, we are particularly upset about the beheading, the sort of actual process of putting people out and cutting their heads off, particularly when you see it on video. We've never really seen it on video before, and so not on this scale. But of course, execution is something which is quite available in the world. It's a state-practiced activity, and in many ways, until we get rid of state execution, we won't get rid of the idea that in some way there's something defensible about it.
I think, while in principle I agree with Jude, I think obviously there are problems to a world agreement, and the main problem is that who is an honest broker? Who trusts the Americans anymore after what they've done, right? The UN has been steadily emasculated over the decades. If you go back to the 50s and the 60s, and the UN played a very important role in civil wars in Africa and other places, in actually mediating them and solving them, even in the Korean crisis. But that they can't do. The Americans, till the Iraq misadventure, could possibly have been someone, but who would trust them? And who would trust the Chinese, or who would trust the Russians? But I think the point about inequality that John and Jude both made, I think is absolutely crucial. That inequalities have always been there in human society, right? There was no perfect golden age where we all led a happy life and a peaceful and content and non-violent life. But the understanding and perception of inequality has grown radically. So as John said, not just the mobile phone, the television or the advertisement. If you come to my hometown Bangalore. I'll give you an example from Bangalore. Bangalore is regarded as the boom city. It's where the IT industries are, it's flourishing. Now, a famous Kannada film star died. Kannada is the language of the state, spoken by about 50 million people, a rich, sophisticated literary language like most of the languages of South Asia. A famous Kannada film star died. And there was rioting by young men. And these were young men in the north and the west of the city, which are the depressed industrial areas. These were the men who could not get employment in the south and the east, where you have IBM and Microsoft and Infosys and so on. But they can see how the other half lives, through advertisements on the streets, through television, and the kind of manifest anger of young men. And Gandhi used to say, I mean, maybe it will be seen as an essentialist statement, but he was right. He said he learned his non-violence from women, because men tend to be more violent in many, many respects. But Gandhi also says something very interesting. I don't know whether it applies at an international level. Gandhi, in 1929, through the 20s, and we are speaking in Bangladesh, in Bengal, in undivided Bengal, there was a cult of young men who thought that the way to get the British out was by throwing bombs at them, attacking British officials, throwing bombs in government offices. And this then carried over to the Punjab, and the great revolutionary Bhagat Singh was executed. Gandhi wrote a famous essay called The Cult of the Bomb. And in that essay, he pointed out that why non-violence is not just that non-violence is more efficacious, is preferable morally. It's also more efficacious. If you use violence, state retribution comes back to you. Ordinary people suffer. What happened in Iraq, or what happened in Afghanistan as a result of violence, or what happens in India today, when you have Maoist violence, is that the government goes in and burns tribal villages. So violence will never get you your goal. Gandhi argued in this famous essay, The Cult of the Bomb, that if you adopt violent means to bring about independence, political independence, or social justice, in fact, you will increase military retaliation against yourself, and innocence will be sacrificed. So I think young men, there's a cult of violence. Perhaps it is, I don't know enough about Islamic theology to understand why they are willing to sacrifice their lives. But I just add one footnote, that this an interesting historical fact, that the idea of the suicide bomb was not invented by Muslim jihadists, it was invented by Tamil Hindus in Sri Lanka. Right? That's, I think, and it was then taken over. And but I think the fact that inequality is so visible, and hence the anger against it by those who feel disadvantaged, who feel that they don't have the kind of life that Tom Friedman extolled, is available to maybe 20% of the world.
Yeah. Can we take a couple of more questions? Yeah. There should be on the floor.
As you said, Saudi Arabia still remains medieval and is exporting Wahhabism to other countries, even to Bangladesh. And no country in the world seems to be able to contain them. What do you think should be done about this? About containing Saudi Arabia's medievalism.
Who would like to take that one?
Saudi Arabia's medievalism.
What should be done? What should be the Western response?
Well, I think above all to investigate it and understand it, and then act upon what one understands. There's some very brilliant people in Saudi Arabia. There are who bitterly disagree with, for example, the discrimination against women, and who bitterly disagree with the fundamentals of Wahhabism, and actually disagree with what is being done to Mecca, which is its translation from quite a simple place of pilgrimage to a shopping mall that would be interchangeable with anything in Virginia or California, although bigger. It is that we don't talk about it either to them or even amongst ourselves. There is no discussion, and it's not only Saudi Arabia. There are other elements of it around. I think we we should not compromise our own principles in order to ensure our own economic sustainability. We have entered some terrible compromises without ever really exploring what the consequences are. I would say investigate and understand.
Well, I think, sorry to be so cynical, but it's hard to imagine any sustained action against Saudi Arabia from the West, partly because they see it now as a bulwark against Iran, which the Americans continue to be suspicious about. Again, one of the bitter ironies about global affairs or global peace today is that of the 5 members of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, I think are the 5 largest sellers of arms to other countries. So, John and I were talking before this, that, the British, for example, the land where modern democracy was born, where historically writers and activists have fled to get exiled from brutal regimes all over the world, right? And Britain, in the last, as John and I were talking just before, in the last month or 6 weeks, the British Prime Minister has abjectly genuflected towards Xi Jinping, and then to Sirsi of Egypt, and now to the somewhat odious Prime Minister of my own country. I suppose in large part because as far as India and Egypt are concerned, I think the British want to sell them fighter planes. As far as China is concerned, they probably want a larger share of the pie. China may have its own fighter planes. So I think this goes back to my point. I'm sorry to be so bleak, but part of the job of a historian is to be skeptical about happiness and peace and utopia, and to show how difficult it is to achieve any of those. There are no honest brokers left in the world today. Maybe the Scandinavian countries. I think maybe Norway where women are treated much better than in other parts of the world, for example, which has not, so far as I know, in recent memory, waged war on other countries, where levels of inequality are manageable. But you'll have to have someone like Norway as an honest broker. It can't be America, it can't be Britain, it can't be China, it can't be Russia. So these are really the hard questions that face the world today. And we just have to live with it. I agree with John. There'll be no World War III, but there'll be steady, continuing conflict of different kinds through most of the world for the foreseeable future. And we'll just have to negotiate our way around it.
Jude?
Yeah, it's interesting. Even the tone in the way that we're discussing Saudi Arabia has a sort of sidestepping anxiousness to it. It reminds me of when people talk about their dysfunctional father. I haven't got a dysfunctional father, I have to say, thank goodness. But, when people have got an abusive father, they often know they can't tackle it. And so they say, well, we'll sort out the family around it, but we'll never actually address the issue. And it is true that probably every powerful, really, really powerful person in the world, the small number of them, they will all have intimate conversations with Saudis. They will, I'm sure. And I'm interested to know why they haven't all sat down together and gone, look, folks, there's something we have to change around here. The question will make me go back to the UK and ask some of those people more about why don't we actually call out Saudi Arabia to be much more of a leader in the world rather than a shadowy figure. How many arms can we sell them? What are they doing with all these arms anyway, John?
Well, funny enough, I gave a talk the other day in Britain to what I thought was a fairly, ordinary audience and the rest of it. And I talked more or less as we've talked here about Saudi Arabia. And a guy jumped up and said, I am a recently retired British general. And I want to tell you that if the House of Saud fell, the world would feel something the like of which it has never thought about.
What does that mean?
What it means is something much worse would follow. I don't know what that would be, but
it's like King Lear.
Well,
Yes.
I presume the implication was that an ISIL-style outfit would take power. But I mean, you know, because we know so little about the place, we have no idea what these forces really are and what would happen. I have no idea, no idea. I mean, you're right, we do tiptoe around it because nobody talks about it. And the other day I did actually ask the British Prime Minister a question about Saudi Arabia. I asked, and I've never mentioned Saudi Arabia to a British Prime Minister before, and I've never heard one talk about Saudi Arabia except in terms of abject friendship. There's a good non sequitur. Abject friendship. This was about the fact that the British had traded their vote with the Saudis to get the Saudis onto the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And I just asked him how it was that a country that, what interest it was for us to have a country that had a very bad record on human rights should now be on the Human Rights Council. Worse than that, the chair of the Human Rights Council. He didn't have any particular answer. In fact, he was very clear he'd never been asked about Saudi Arabia before. But what can one do?
Just listening to you, one thing that's striking me again, the way we have come back to the Saudi issue and how no one wants to talk about it, it's, process of inertia, and through that, it's almost as if these sacrosanct fetish are formed. And Saudis are not the only one, the other is Israel. Israel at least gets talked about and very fiercely debated, but at least from the American vantage, it's a given. You can talk about it all you want, but it's not going to change. The policy is not going to change. And with the Saudis, you don't even talk about it. And I think partly what has become institutionalized in the West, in America especially, but also in Britain and parts of, in the case of Saudis and many other governments, is this fear of a great unspecified unknown, that if they are challenged, if this is disturbed, the fallout could be so terrible that in the process, like you said, like the difficult father, it's kept in place and everything else around it is being sorted. And in reality, possibly what has come about all around it, from resentments born of Palestinian occupation, from Syria and other implosions, invasion of Iraq, is probably in totality already far worse than whatever would have come out of challenging Saudi Arabia in 2001, but we were just not ready to go there. I think we have time for one last question. Can we take a question and then come back to you? Is there a hand somewhere?
Right in the middle, yeah.
I think there's one in the, okay, also there's one in the back. Maybe we should go to the back once. And then we'll take questions. We'll take the final questions together and see how much we can cover. In the back, please.
Thank you so much. I have a question that whoever becomes the next president of US will have a great impact on international scenario. So what I want to know is, when the US people are voting, how much are they taking the international affairs policy of the next upcoming US president into consideration? And how much is the media in US working to establish the fact among the general people that Islam is not the problem is somewhere else? Thank you.
Is there any other questions? Towards the front, in the middle, I think.
The two women in the front.
Okay, so we'll come to that too. We'll take, is there a?
We all suffer from a degree of willful blindness. I've heard all of you, and it's very easy, and rightfully so, to blame America for just about your kitchen sink as well. But the problem remains that you can or cannot do without America. Would you be comfortable with Saddam Hussein still slaughtering Kurds, or Assad gassing his own people?
Okay, and there's a lady in the front.
So my question is about dialogue. We sit here talking about we should do this and we should impose that and we this. Have we ever asked the Saudis, have we ever gone to the leaders of ISIL to ask them to come to the table and talk?
So we have basically two questions about America, what America does, and would we be ready to deal with the consequences of a war where America didn't play a central role? And in the front, question about, is ISIL someone you could talk to?
One more question.
Was there one more?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask a question and not make any comments. Anyway, so but I have one question, just one question, before I move on to one more, perhaps. if you allow me the time.
I'm
Okay, the
afraid we
first
are
question
really running
is,
out
what's
of
the
time
meaning
now.
of opening plenary? What is plenary?
Okay.
And what do you mean when you say the world is round?
Okay, thank you. There's a gentleman there on the right.
And just one last question, if I may. Why is the talk so centered on negativism? Why are the media in the world so bent on focusing on the negatives rather than on the positives? Because the positives have always outweighed the negatives. So how does it benefit the media to divert people's attention to always terrors and wars?
Thank you.
Why?
This will be the last question. The gentleman on the front right.
Thank you. The conversation has rambled on covering the world is round in a sense, and to that extent covering all the hotspots. And with the American involvement, it reminds me of this, I have to say this comment is, I saw this bumper sticker saying, "Be nice to America or we shall bring democracy to your country." Well, the question is, do you see that in a number of countries now, there is a tremendous polarized society, very definitively polarized. And there is also a tendency in the political circles of a conservatism towards a unilateral direction in politics, or at least a dominant one dimension to the political structures of the country. Now that creates a contradiction which can only lead to even more violence.
Thank you. So we've got a bunch of questions. Maybe I'll just distribute them among you and see what you can do. One question about the alleged centrality of America and what their continuing impact will be after the next elections. A question about this unidirection in many countries where maybe it's becoming more one party or less democracy and so on. And also there was a question about ISIL, whether there's somebody you can talk to.
I'll just quickly respond to two or three of the questions. One is the very good question about the media, that the media often highlights negativity. But our panel is a stunning exception, because the only person with good news was Jon Snow, who actually pointed out that Latin America and Africa, correctly pointed out something we tend to ignore. The two large continents are steadily, quietly becoming more democratic, slightly more prosperous, of course with problems of their own, coalesce, and so on. So I think that was a very important question. I think that's linked to the other question about unidirectional change. I think, again, history is full of, it's not linear, it's zigzag. You know, you go up, you go down. I talked in my own country of how we have achieved some success in the battle against caste inequality, but much less success in the battle against gender inequality. There is, in many ways, India is a more open society now. You don't have to be born to privilege to start a business. Entrepreneurs come from all communities. So it's always, history always operates in a complicated way. And that's been the case. There was never a golden age, there will never be a golden age. There's only incremental change, slowly, one step at a time. Lastly, about America, if I may say.